Hello wonderful people, it's Wild here. Today I'll be showing you 12 different block palettes and how you can use them to transform your builds. Along the way, I'll be sharing some tips and tricks for creating your own color palettes and for implementing them into your world. I'll be using a number of cottagecore and fantasy style builds to showcase these block palettes, and the tutorial for all of them will be in the description down below. Let's get started. For our first set of block palettes, we're looking at this Cottagecore tower house. Now you can see I have a simple block palette with 4 key features. We have the cut copper block, and I've got oxidized, so it's this lovely blue color. Then we have stripped spruce logs, as well as the spruce texture that goes along with it. We've got stone bricks, oak planks, and then little hints of dark prismarine, which you can see behind the door here. So it's kind of got a very neutral base with the pops of color coming from the copper and the prismarine. One of the key things about this block palette that pulls the whole build together is that it's relatively simple. That means that the different features like the rising turrets and the different shaped roof lines are pulled together by a common theme. Now let's change up the block palette and see what it looks like. So here we have the transformed look. You can see it has had quite a dramatic effect on the overall look of the build, but let's have a look at what we've done with the block palette. So you can see that we have kept the stone brick the same throughout the build, as that's a great neutral base. But we've gone ahead and changed all of the other blocks around. So we've kept wood where we've got wood all throughout the build, but we've warmed it up with some dark oak and jungle wood. And then instead of these cooler toned blue blocks, I've gone and replaced them with some bricks and some terracotta. Customizing a build like this can really change the way you can use a build. With the blue color palette, this build looks great in a birch forest as a cozy house, but with these darker, richer colors, it would look lovely in a dark oak forest, perhaps as a library. This next build here is a honeycomb cottage, and you can see its main feature is this honeycomb block roof. Let's have a look at the color palette. Stone is once again a really good go-to base, and I've mixed in some cobble as well as the stone brick for a bit of texture. Then we've got spruce and 2 types of birch. And then we've got our honeycomb showcase block. So when we're changing up the design of this build, we want to make sure we keep the roof the key feature by using a really unique block. It's a great thing to keep in mind when designing a block palette to be adventurous. So for this build, we're going to be using some amethyst in place of the honeycomb. Let's see how that's going to look. Here we go, the roof is now made out of amethyst. I've also made a few other changes. You can see here, based on our block palette, I kept the walls the same, made out of the birch planks here. But I've then gone ahead and replaced all the spruce with some dark oak, which is a nice bold choice which reflects the bolder base made out of deep slate. You can see I've also made a few other changes to the build to fit in with the amethyst theme. Like I've changed some blocks in the windows to purple glass, and I've replaced these planters with some magical looking growing amethysts. I've also used some purple flowers around the build to tie in with the roof. This next build of a moss cottage really showcases my next tip for building a great block palette, so let's have a look at it. My tip here is to use a mixture of textures, and you can see we've certainly done this throughout the build. We've got this brick texture, this softer moss texture which we've mixed in the walls as well as the roof. We've got planks and wood texture, some smoother blocks as well in the walls. And you can even see all throughout the build that I've mixed up the texture of each of these sections. For this build, I want to keep the mossy roof, but I want to change up the colors a little bit. So let's have a look at the block palette I'll be replacing it with. You can see I'm going to be replacing some of the green around these walls with some yellow, and that means I'm going to tie in the flowers on the roof as well. So here you can see a variation on my moss house. This time I'm featuring the color yellow, which works really well with the color green, and I've incorporated all the yellow flowers, including these daisies which have yellow centers, to tie the yellow all the way up. You'll also notice I've switched out the spruce wood from the first version for some oak wood, which ties in well with the warm color of the yellow terracotta. And you could customize this build with any number of colors based on the flowers. Perhaps you could have blue flowers and blue walls. Or you could go for a totally green look and just replace the flowers with ferns. This next build is an autumn cottage, and we've really set the scene here with our block palette. You can see it's got these rich autumn colors with orange as our showcase, but we're really going to transform this build by switching out the orange for some purple, and we're even going to bring in some crimson wood. One thing you do need to think about when creating a block palette is the details of a build. So for this build, we've got these copper pipes in the design, so when we transfer it over to a different block palette, we need to think of a good substitute, and in this case, we're going to be using some end rods. So here is the same build with our transformed block palette. A transformation like this one really showcases how important a block palette is to the feel of a design. This original autumn toned palette gave a moody feel to the build, whereas the bright pinks and the pop of a magical wood really makes this suit a fairy style world. It's important to keep in mind, however, whether you're going for a darker feeling build or a lighter feeling one, that you want to mix up the dark and light blocks within the block palette itself. We've got these lighter tones in the oak and the orange, contrasted by the dark oak and even the spruce. And over this side, we have the same sort of contrast with the light, bright white blocks contrasting against the darker crimson. In this case, the contrast comes because our light block is extra light, but in this case, it comes from our darker block being extra dark. Next, let's look at the build from my aesthetic fairy cottage tutorial. You can see here the showcase block as the brick, but the whole build has a muted tone to it, which creates quite a peaceful look. I've got moss growing up on the bricks, and our main wall block comes in the form of some sandstone as well as some birch. You can see this is a relatively simple block palette, but it has a really effective look. But if you'd like to create something with a bit more contrast, perhaps you could look at some color theory to create some contrasting colors. Here I've gone with some purple with purple, which contrasts perfectly with the teal of some warped wood, but you could experiment and try all sorts of color combinations. Some other contrasting colors you could experiment with are violet and yellow, green and pink, and red and blue. But for now, let's see how this pinky purple and blue-green look on this build. So here's the transformed fairy cottage. Now you can see I've had to get a bit creative. On the other block palette, we had walls here and here. However, purple walls don't exist, so to tie in the purple, I've put a purple pillar here with a warped button on the edge for a bit of detail, and then I've even used some prismarine walls. Now there's a lighter color, reflects the lighter color in the purple, but it exists as a wall, which means we can use it. You can also see I've switched out the red flowers for these lily of the valley, and having a simple white flower like this works on this build because we have got such a lot of color in the roof and window decorations. Now let's look at this mushroom house. When I originally created it, I went with this red and white classic toadstool design. But since this is a fairy mushroom, we can have any color we like, and I think I'd like to try it in blue. Now, because I am changing out this red block color, I'd like to also change up the build a little bit. So for this one, I'm going to be switching out the birch for some oak, and I'm also going to be switching out the birch boards that make up the walls. So let's see how this transformation works. Wow, I really like the juxtaposition between the warm colors in the house and the cooler colors of the mushroom with this build. This mushroom really highlights how there are options when it comes to choosing your color palette. With the first set of colors, all of the tones were quite warm, and then we had the neutral stone. But it's also fun to break out of the mold of having either warm or cool colors and have a mixture of the two. It is important, however, if you do decide to mix warm and cool colors, to tie them together. So wherever I've got warm, like up here in this bay window section, I've got a little bit of cool blue mixed in as well, as I do up here on top of the mushroom, where I have a bit of the warm wood breaking up the blue cool background. Now let's have another look at all these different block palettes to give you lots of inspiration for your builds. So here you can see there's a great variety of block palettes, and you can utilize so many blocks in Minecraft, you don't always have to go with the most common ones. Of course, wood textures and stone are very useful, so you might find yourself including them in builds often, but don't be afraid to break out of the box, and you can use these palettes for any style of build, and you've seen how well they work for cottagecore style builds. So now you have a whole lot of ideas for block palettes you can use to customize your builds. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, please consider subscribing, it really helps me out, and check out my Patreon if you'd like to support me further. See you in another video!